The story of Lucky Strike cigarettes during World War II is not merely a tale of tobacco and paper. It is the story of how an entire industrial complex transformed itself overnight to meet the insatiable demands of a global conflict, how a consumer product became a strategic necessity, and how the machinery of war created habits that would define a generation. To understand this transformation, we must begin not in the gleaming factories of Richmond, Virginia, but in the red clay fields of North Carolina and Virginia, where the journey of every Lucky Strike began. The tobacco that would eventually find its way into millions of khaki pockets started as tiny seeds planted in carefully tended beds. These seeds, smaller than grains of sand, required meticulous attention from farmers who understood that the quality of their crop would determine their livelihood. By early spring, when the seedlings reached about 6 inches in height, they were transplanted into fields that stretched across the Piedmont region like a patchwork quilt of green. The soil here was perfect, a combination of clay and sand that drained well but retained enough moisture to nurture the broad leaves that would become the heart of American blended tobacco. Farmers walked these fields daily, their hands stained dark from handling the sticky leaves, checking for hornworms that could devastate a crop overnight, monitoring the subtle color changes that signaled readiness for harvest. The harvest itself was an art form that had been perfected over generations. Yes, workers moved down the rows in the oppressive summer heat, their fingers selecting only the ripest leaves from each plant. The bottom leaves came first, called sand lugs because they grew closest to the soil. Then came the middle leaves, and finally the top leaves, each harvesting requiring judgment, calls that separated experienced hands from novices. A single plant might be harvested 5 or 6 times over the growing season, each pass through the field yielding leaves at their optimal maturity. These leaves were then loaded onto wagons and transported to curing barns, massive wooden structures that dotted the landscape like sentinels. Inside these barns, the leaves hung from tier poles in the stifling darkness, the air thick with the sweet, almost nauseating smell of fermenting tobacco. For weeks, fires burned at carefully controlled temperatures, transforming the green leaves into the golden brown tobacco that buyers would recognize. The curing process was chemistry and instinct combined, with barn operators adjusting ventilation and heat based on how the leaves felt between their fingers and the aroma that filled the air. Once cured, the tobacco entered a complex transportation network that would have impressed any logistics officer. Hogsheads, massive wooden barrels weighing up to 1,000 pounds when filled, were loaded onto trucks and driven to railway depots where they joined a seemingly endless procession heading north and east. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Southern Railway, and the Atlantic Coast Line all dedicated significant portions of their rolling stock to tobacco transport during the war years. Yet these trains rattled through the night, their wheels clicking over rail joints in a rhythmic pattern that became the soundtrack of wartime commerce. At switching yards in cities like Durham and Winston-Salem, workers used specially designed hooks to maneuver the heavy hogsheads, stacking them in freight cars with an efficiency born of practice. The trains themselves were often delayed by higher priority military shipments, waiting on sidings while trainloads of tanks, artillery, and ammunition thundered past. Yet the tobacco kept moving, because by 1942, Lucky Strike cigarettes had become nearly as essential to military operations as bullets and fuel. The American Tobacco Company's factories in Richmond represented the pinnacle of industrial cigarette manufacturing. The main facility sprawled across multiple city blocks, a complex of brick buildings connected by enclosed walkways and underground tunnels. Here, the tobacco that had begun its journey in Carolina fields underwent a transformation that would have seemed like magic to those farmers. The hogsheads arrived at loading docks where workers pried off the wooden lids with crowbars, releasing the compressed tobacco inside. This tobacco, still in leaf form, moved on conveyor belts to the conditioning room, a cavernous space where it was exposed to carefully controlled humidity and temperature. The conditioning process was crucial because tobacco that was too dry would shatter during processing. while tobacco that was too moist would clog the machinery. Industrial humidifiers the size of automobiles filled the room with a fine mist, while workers in white coats moved among the piles, testing the leaves with instruments that measured moisture content to within a fraction of a percent. From conditioning, the tobacco moved to the stemming department, where an army of workers, predominantly women due to wartime labor shortages, sat at long tables removing the thick central vein from each leaf. This was tedious work that required quick hands and sharp eyes. The women developed a rhythm, picking up a leaf, tearing out the stem, and tossing the halves into baskets in one fluid motion. During peak production in 1943, the Richmond facility employed over 5,000 people in stemming alone, working in 3 shifts around the clock. The removed stems were not wasted. They were collected separately and would later be processed into reconstituted tobacco sheet, a technology that allowed manufacturers to use every scrap of the expensive raw material. The stem tobacco then entered the cutting department, and here was where the true industrial might of American manufacturing revealed itself. The cutting machines were marvels of precision engineering, each one weighing several tons and containing dozens of circular blades arranged like the pages of a book. The tobacco was fed into these machines in compressed blocks, and the blades sliced through them with such speed that the individual cuts were invisible to the naked eye. The resulting shred tobacco fell into collection bins below, creating a pile that looked like fine straw. The cut had to be precise because it affected everything from burn rate to flavor. Too fine a cut and the cigarette would burn too quickly, too coarse, and it would not draw properly. The machines ran constantly, their mechanical hum punctuated by the sharp metallic sound of blades being sharpened and replaced by maintenance crews who prowled the floor with their toolboxes. The blending department was where art met science in the most literal sense. Lucky Strike's distinctive flavor came from a proprietary blend of bright Virginia tobacco, burley tobacco from Kentucky, and small amounts of Turkish and Oriental tobaccos imported at great expense and difficulty during the war years. Master blenders, men who had spent decades learning their craft, supervised the mixing process with the intensity of chemists working on classified formulas. The tobaccos were combined in enormous rotating drums that looked like horizontal silos, each one capable of holding thousands of pounds. The rotation ensured even mixing, but it was the blender's eye and nose that ultimately determined when the batch was ready. They would reach into sample ports, pull out handfuls of the mixed tobacco, and evaluate it with senses trained to detect the subtlest variations. A batch that was off by even a small percentage might be rejected and sent back for adjustment because consistency was paramount. Soldiers stationed in North Africa had to receive the same Lucky Strike experience as those in the Pacific, and that required absolute uniformity in every cigarette produced. After blending came flavoring, a process shrouded in secrecy that involved the application of casing and top flavoring solutions. These were liquid mixtures containing sugars, humectants, and aromatic compounds that gave Lucky Strike its characteristic taste. The tobacco passed through spray chambers, where atomizers created a fine mist that coated every shred. The amount of flavoring applied was measured in fractions of an ounce per 100 pounds of tobacco, yet it made all the difference in the final product. The flavored tobacco then moved to the drying department, where it passed through long rotating drums heated by steam coils. This removed excess moisture from the flavoring process and brought the tobacco to its final moisture content, typically around 12 to 13%. Get this wrong, and the cigarettes would either be too harsh or would not stay lit. The making department was the heart of the factory, a vast hall filled with cigarette-making machines that operated with a hypnotic precision. These machines, primarily manufactured by the Moulins Machine Company of London, I represented the cutting edge of automated production. Each machine could produce up to 1,000 cigarettes per minute, a rate that would have been impossible to imagine just a generation earlier. The process began with paper. Massive rolls of cigarette paper imported from France before the war, and later manufactured domestically in mills that had converted from other paper products. The paper fed into the machine from below, forming a continuous tube as it wrapped around a stream of tobacco that flowed from a hopper above. The tobacco was metered precisely, with a vacuum system that drew it into the paper tube at exactly the right density. Too loose, and the cigarette would not draw well. Too tight, and it would be difficult to smoke. As the continuous tobacco rod emerged from the forming section, it passed under a glue applicator that sealed the paper seam with a thin line of vegetable-based adhesive. A hot air jet dried the glue instantly, and then came the cutting mechanism, a rotating knife that sliced the continuous rod into individual cigarette lengths with such speed that the separated cigarettes appeared to leap forward onto the next conveyor. The cutting had to be precise to within a millimeter, because variations in length would affect the cigarette count in each pack and potentially cause issues with the packaging machinery downstream. Each machine had an operator who watched for problems, but these machines were remarkably reliable, running for hours with only occasional adjustments. The cigarettes then moved to the tipping department, where the distinctive Lucky Strike filter was added. Actually, this is where historical accuracy requires clarification. During World War II, Lucky Strike cigarettes were not filtered. The filtered cigarette would not become dominant until the 1950s. What the war-era Lucky Strikes had was a simple cork tip printed directly onto the paper to give the appearance of a mouthpiece. This was purely aesthetic, but had become part of the brand identity. For other cigarettes in the American Tobacco Company's portfolio that did have cork tips during this era, the tipping process involved cutting small pieces of cork-colored paper and attaching them to one end of the cigarette with adhesive. This was done by specialized machines that handled the delicate cigarettes with surprising gentleness, using vacuum pickups to avoid crushing them. Inspection came next, and this was where human judgment remained irreplaceable despite all the mechanical sophistication. Women sat at long inspection tables as cigarettes flowed past them in single file on moving belts. Their trained eyes scanned for defects: torn paper, loose ends, discolored tips, misshapen bodies. Any cigarette that did not meet standards was plucked from the line with a motion so quick it seemed automatic. These rejected cigarettes fell into bins below the tables and would later be opened, and the tobacco recycled back into production. The inspection standards during the war were actually stricter than in peacetime because the military had specified quality requirements in their contracts. A poorly made cigarette that came apart in a soldier's pocket or failed to light in wet conditions was not merely a defect. It was a failure to support the war effort. The packaging department was organized chaos, a space where dozens of processes occurred simultaneously in a carefully orchestrated sequence. The cigarettes arrived from inspection via overhead conveyors that distributed them to individual packing machines. These machines were mechanical symphonies, taking loose cigarettes and arranging them into the iconic Lucky Strike pack with its green packaging that would become one of the most famous design changes of the war. The original Lucky Strike package featured a dark green circle against a white background, but in 1942, the company changed to a white package with the slogan, "Lucky Strike, green has gone to war." The official explanation was that the copper-based green ink was needed for the war effort, though many historians believe this was primarily a marketing decision that happened to align with wartime sensibilities. Regardless of the reasoning, the white pack became the face of Lucky Strike for the duration of the war and beyond. The packing machines picked up exactly 20 cigarettes using a vacuum plate array that lifted them as a group. These were then inverted and pushed into a feeding mechanism that arranged them in the traditional 4 rows of 5 cigarettes each. A sheet of foil inner wrapper was picked from a stack, formed into a U shape by mechanical fingers, and wrapped around the cigarette block. The foil kept the cigarettes fresh and provided a satisfying crackling sound when opened. Over this went the paper outer wrapper, pre-printed with the Lucky Strike branding, which was folded around the pack with corners so crisp they appeared handmade. Each pack was then sealed with a tax stamp, a small piece of paper that served as proof that excise taxes had been paid. During the war years, these stamps were green for cigarettes destined for military distribution, indicating a reduced or waived tax rate as part of the war support effort. The filled packs emerged from the machines and were immediately transferred to cartoning equipment that arranged 10 packs into a single carton. The cartons were made from paperboard that had been cut and pre-folded, requiring only the insertion of the packs and the application of glue to the end flaps to complete them. These cartons were then grouped into larger shipping cases. So wooden crates in the early war years and later, corrugated cardboard cases as materials became more efficiently allocated. Each case was stenciled with destination information, lot numbers, and production dates using rubber stamps and ink rollers operated by workers who became so proficient they could mark a case in seconds without looking. The warehouse where finished cigarettes awaited shipment was a structure in itself, a building large enough to house several football fields. Here, cases were stacked on wooden pallets 20 high, creating walls of Lucky Strikes that represented millions of cigarettes. Forklifts, a relatively new technology that the war had accelerated into common use, moved through the aisles carrying loads that would have required a dozen men with hand trucks in an earlier era. The warehouse operated on a strict first-in first-out system to ensure freshness, with workers maintaining detailed logs of every pallet's arrival and departure. The ambient temperature and humidity were controlled because tobacco was hygroscopic, constantly exchanging moisture with the air. Too much humidity and the cigarettes would become soggy and moldy. Too little, and they would dry out and become harsh. The distribution network that moved Lucky Strikes from Richmond to fighting men around the globe was a logistical achievement that rivaled any military operation. Trucks from the warehouse drove to rail yards where the cases were loaded into freight cars bound for ports of embarkation. New York, Baltimore, Norfolk, and Charleston all served as major departure points, with cigarettes sharing cargo space with every other necessity of war. At the ports, longshoremen used cargo nets to lift pallets into the holds of transport ships, packing them alongside ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement parts. The ships sailed in convoys for protection against submarines, their precious cargo representing not just commerce, but morale. The Navy understood that a carton of cigarettes could mean as much to a sailor on a destroyer in the North Atlantic as hot food or mail from home. The impact of this industrial effort on American culture cannot be overstated. Before the war, cigarette smoking was common, but not universal. By war's end, it had become a defining characteristic of an entire generation. The military distributed cigarettes freely, including them in rations alongside food. Soldiers received cigarettes in their C rations and K rations, and they could purchase them at post exchanges for pennies a pack. This institutional support for smoking, combined with the stress of combat and the social nature of sharing cigarettes, created millions of new smokers who would carry the habit home. The tobacco industry, and Lucky Strike in particular, invested heavily in military marketing, placing advertisements in armed forces newspapers, sponsoring radio programs broadcast to troops, and ensuring that their brand was always available and always visible. The Richmond factory's production during the peak war years exceeded anything the company had achieved in peacetime. Running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the facility produced billions of cigarettes annually. The workers, many of them women who had taken jobs previously held by men now in uniform, took pride in their contribution to the war effort. Signs throughout the factory reminded them that every cigarette they made would bring comfort to a fighting man, that their attention to quality was as important as the work of any munitions factory. This was not mere propaganda. The evidence appeared in letters from the front, in photographs showing soldiers with cigarettes dangling from their lips, in the cultural artifacts of a generation for whom the ritual of lighting a Lucky Strike became inseparable from the experience of war. The machinery itself required constant maintenance, a task that fell to a small army of mechanics and engineers who moved through the factory like surgeons making rounds. Every machine had a maintenance schedule, on with some requiring daily attention, and others needing weekly or monthly servicing. During scheduled downtimes, usually one shift per week, crews would disassemble key components, clean them with solvent baths, replace worn parts, and reassemble everything with the precision that precision manufacturing demanded. The factory maintained its own machine shop, where replacement parts were fabricated when commercial sources could not supply them fast enough. Lathes, milling machines, and drill presses operated alongside the cigarette-making equipment, producing the gears, shafts, and specialized components that kept production flowing. The quality control department operated a laboratory that would have been at home in any chemical plant. Technicians tested samples from every production run, measuring moisture content, nicotine levels, ink, and other chemical markers to ensure consistency. They also conducted burn tests, lighting sample cigarettes in controlled environments, and timing how long they smoked, checking for even burn and proper ash characteristics. The ash was important because cigarettes that produced excessive ash or ash that fell off too easily were considered defective. Some samples were sent to sensory evaluation panels, where trained tasters would smoke them and provide feedback on flavor and draw. This might seem like a pleasant job until one considers that these evaluators might smoke dozens of cigarettes per day, making careful notes on subtle differences that would escape casual smokers. As the war progressed into its final years, the strain on the industrial system became evident. Raw materials that had been abundant in 1942 were scarce by 1944. Turkish tobacco imports ceased almost entirely as the Mediterranean became a war zone. Certain types of paper became harder to source, as mills were diverted to military contracts for map paper and other specialized products. Yet the Richmond factory adapted, reformulating blends to work with available tobaccos, finding alternative suppliers for materials, and engineering workarounds for shortages. This adaptability, this ability to maintain production under increasingly difficult circumstances, was itself a form of war work, as vital as anything produced in a tank factory. The story of the Lucky Strike factory during World War II is ultimately a story about American industrial capacity and its ability to transform consumer goods production into war support. It is about the thousands of workers who showed up every day to jobs that were repetitive and sometimes dangerous in an era before modern safety regulations, motivated by paychecks and patriotism in roughly equal measure. It is about engineers who kept machinery running beyond its designed lifespan and plant managers who juggled supply shortages and production quotas with the skill of battlefield commanders. And it is about a product that, for better or worse, became so intertwined with the American military experience that generations would associate the smell of tobacco smoke with sacrifice and service. The Richmond factory continued operations long after the war ended, but it never again achieved quite the same intensity of purpose that drove it during those years when every cigarette carried the weight of history.